This is a real-life island battle royale. 341 people ended up stranded, and only 122 made it out alive. The whole thing shows just how wild and complicated human nature can get when survival is on the line. In the 1600s, the Dutch controlled Batavia, and their ship, the Batavia, was wrecked off the coast of what is now Western Australia. More than 100 people died in the grounding, but the carnage didn't end there. What befell the survivors was sheer horror, anarchy, tyranny, madness, murder, and rape, in a reign of terror where people were picked off one by one. In the end, only about a third of the 340 passengers and crew would live, and the waters off Western Australia were cast as the harsh and unforgiving end of the earth. So what really happened? Let's go back to year 1628 and break down this tragic story. During the Age of Exploration, European nations set sail to discover the world and seek new business opportunities across the seas. As one of the important members of Europe, the Netherlands was also one of them. The Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, quickly seized the opportunity to rise and became the dominant maritime power of the 17th and 18th centuries. It even established the world's first stock exchange in Amsterdam, and later grew to become the wealthiest private company in the world. At the time, the European spice trade was booming. The spice trade became extremely popular and highly profitable, so many companies began establishing their own spice trade routes. Of course, the Dutch East India Company would not miss this opportunity. It quickly built a huge fleet for foreign trade. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it dominated the spice trade between the East Indies and the Netherlands. The company not only established a monopoly on Eastern trade, but also formed its own mercenary forces and even issued its own currency. Although it was a private company, it was officially recognized by the Dutch government, which allowed it to sign formal agreements with other nations and rule the land. On the 27th of October 1628, the Dutch East India Company organized a foreign trade voyage. This time, the newly built Batavia joined the voyage. This was its first voyage. The ship was 56.6 meters long and 55 meters high, and had a tonnage of around 1,200 tons, and was armed with 24 cast-iron cannons along with several bronze guns. The voyage set out from the port of Texel in the Netherlands, rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southwestern tip of Africa, and headed toward Batavia on Java Island. Officially, the Batavia carried 341 people, mostly sailors and soldiers, along with a few officers, women, and children. At the same time, the ship carried a large amount of precious cargo, mostly gold coins, silver coins, and jewelry. There were four main characters in today's story. The first was Francisco Pelsaert, the Batavia's fleet commander, a senior Dutch East India Company official with 10 years of experience. The second was Arjen Jacobs, the captain of the Batavia. He skippered the ship and was an experienced sailor. The third was Pelsaert's deputy, Geronimus Cornelis. Originally a pharmacist, he went bankrupt after several lawsuits and joined the Dutch East India Company. Rumor has it, he also wanted to leave the Netherlands due to religious issues. Among the three, the fleet commander and the captain had clashed seriously 2 years earlier, and animosity existed between them. Cornelis and the captain knew each other beforehand, though their relationship was fairly ordinary. Besides the Batavia, 6 other ships joined the voyage. The journey had an inauspicious start. A violent storm separated most of the ships in the convoy, and when calmer weather returned, only 3 of the 7 ships had sight of each other: Batavia, Assendelft, and the Buren. Even though there were only 3 ships, they had to continue the rest of the journey. After this long journey, Cornelis grew dissatisfied with the fleet commander's management. He went to Jacobs to complain, and the two became friends, plotting a mutiny to eliminate Pelsaert and seize the riches. They imagined vanishing to an unknown land, establishing their own kingdom, and being free of anyone's control, using the ship's vast supply of gold and silver. With this in mind, they hatched an evil plan to hijack the ship. After leaving the Cape of Good Hope, where they had stopped for supplies, the captain made his move. His first step was to create the perfect conditions for the mutiny by deliberately steering Batavia off course, separating it from the rest of the fleet. As captain, executing this first step came naturally to him. The second step was to create chaos on board and intensify conflicts among the crew and passengers. But before it could succeed, disaster struck. On the morning of 4 June 1629, the Batavia ran aground on a coral reef near Beacon Island, part of the Houtman Abrolhos, off the western coast off Australia. The crash caused many people to fall into the sea, and the ship was severely damaged. Fortunately, a few small islands were nearby. Most of the passengers and crew managed to get ashore, although 40 people drowned. Before the ship sank completely, the remaining survivors used Batavia's longboats to reach Traders Island. An initial survey of the islands found no fresh water, and the only food available were occasional birds and sea lions. Fortunately, a significant supply of fresh water and foods had been taken from Batavia, which could sustain them for a while. But there were hundreds of people who survived. These water and food were a disaster. Pelsart realized the dire situation and decided to search for water on the mainland. After some time of discussion, a group of 48 people, including of Jacobs, Pelsart, senior officers, a few crew members, and some passengers, left the wreck site in a 30-feet-long boat in search of drinking water. On 7 July 1629, the small team of 48 people decided to row the longboat 3,000 kilometers to their original destination to get help. After 33 days of tough sailing, the team finally arrived in Batavia. After their arrival in Batavia, the company arrested the captain, believing he was responsible for the shipwreck. Later, the governor of the Dutch East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, ordered Pelsart to sail aboard the Sardam with a crew and soldiers to return to the wreck site, rescue any survivors, and recover the cargo. Due to miscalculations involving the sea conditions, the ocean currents, and the Batavia's wreck location, the rescue ship took 63 days to finally find the site. What they couldn't have imagined was that a series of horrific and bloody massacres occurred on the island during the time they were gone. Cornelis, who had planned the hijacking, survived the shipwreck. After the Dutch East India Company officials hurriedly left, they did not assign anyone to manage the remaining survivors. He found desperate survivors with no leader, and he took advantage. Cornelis started by leading a group of his mutinous supporters to run the island. Although he had become the leader, Cornelis was deeply uneasy. Among the 48 people who had left earlier, a few were his conspirators in the ship hijacking. If they were investigated by the company upon reaching their destination and implicated him, even being rescued wouldn't save him from punishment. He also heard that Pelsart had long suspected him and might already know about the hijacking plan, so he thought it would be better to salvage the gold and jewels from the sunken ship and then find a way to escape to the unknown continent of Australia to establish his own kingdom. But looking at the situation now, Cornelis realized that even though he had a group of supporters, it would still be very difficult to fully control all the survivors. However, to carry out this plan, he first needed to eliminate possible opponents. This brings us to the fourth main character of today's story, Wiebe Hayes. Hayes was a young and inexperienced soldier, but he had extraordinary courage and leadership. He led the other soldiers to retrieving food and fresh water that had fallen into the sea during the wreck, easing the survivors' food crisis. He also helped the survivors build temporary shelters, taught them how to hunt birds for food, and organized people to use canvas sheets to collect rainwater. Because of all this, Hayes earned the trust of many survivors, and soon a group of loyal followers gathered around him. Cornelis decided that the first person he needed to get rid of was Hayes. He then moved a group of soldiers led by Hayes to nearby West Wallaby Island, roughly 8 kilometers away. Under the pretense of having them search for water, they were not allowed to carry any weapons and were instructed to send smoke signals when they found water, and they would then be rescued. It was a cunning plan. By sending them to a barren island with nothing but their bare hands, Cornelis was not expecting them to survive. After Hayes leaves, Cornelis started by leading his mutinous supporters to run the island and have all weapons and food supplies commandeered and placed under his control. Later, he feels there are too many survivors. Cornelis planned to reduce the island's population to around 45, so that their supplies would last as long as possible, and begins a massacre on the island. After that, Cornelis creates more and more shipwrecks. Cornelis dealt with anyone who threatened his position by sending them on futile missions for food or fresh water. Soon after they boarded the boats, his accomplices would find a way to sink them or push them overboard, drowning many in the process. With these threats eliminated, Cornelis turned his attention to the remaining survivors left behind. The remaining survivors were divided into small groups on several nearby islands. Over the next few weeks, Cornelis ordered his men to massacre other camps, using any flimsy pretext, such as accusations of theft or dissatisfaction with the management system, to carry out the killings. The killings began with children and the elderly. Cornelis and his henchmen had originally murdered to save themselves. Eventually, they began to kill for pleasure or out of habit. Cornelis never committed any of the murders himself. This allowed him to eliminate his rivals without ever getting his hands dirty. At this point, Cornelis had complete control and was just one step away from his dream of becoming a king. But what he didn't expect was that Hayes and the soldiers he led to search for water had survived in West Wallaby Island. They unexpectedly found good sources of water and many small kangaroos in nearby East Wallaby Island. Initially, they were unaware of the massacres taking place and sent pre-arranged smoke signals announcing their finds. However, they soon learned of the killings from survivors fleeing Beacon Island. Shocked by the news, Hayes quickly rallied his men to prepare for defense. In response, the soldiers devised makeshift weapons from materials washed up from the wreck. They also set a watch so that they were ready for Cornelis men and built a small fort out of limestone and coral blocks. Although their equipment was relatively simple, the soldiers led by Hayes had enough food and water to sustain themselves and maintained high morale. When Cornelis realized that Hayes was actively preparing to fight back, he knew his plan had been exposed. He began organizing his forces to attack West Wallaby Island, aiming to eliminate the threat completely and seize the precious water and food supplies. However, Cornelis's soldiers suffered from low morale, and coupled with a lack of food and water, their strength was severely diminished. Over the course of 2 months, Cornelis launched several attacks against Hayes's group, but each time he was repelled. In the third attack, his forces suffered heavy losses, and he was eventually captured. Although Hayes's side had won, they had also taken significant casualties. If Cornelis had managed another attack, it could have been a deadly final battle. Desperate to rescue their leader or seize the water and food, Cornelis's remaining followers gathered all their manpower and weapons to surround Hayes. This time, the strength of Cornelis's forces far exceeded Hayes's defenders. Hayes's soldiers began to fall back under relentless attacks, finally surrounded by Cornelis's men. Just at this critical moment, the rescue ship from headquarters appeared. Fate seemed to favor courage and justice. Both sides realized that whoever reached the ship first would likely secure victory. Cornelis, as expected, tried to claim it for himself, and both sides rushed toward the rescue ship frantically. In the end, Hayes's soldiers were the first to board the rescue ship. Once on board, they reported to Pelzert about Cornelis's betrayal and the bloody massacres he had carried out on the island. Cornelis's remaining followers, realizing their actions had been exposed and that there was no chance of escape, surrendered and confessed their crimes. After 2 months of terror, the massacre on the island finally came to an end, and for the survivors, the nightmare was over. After every mutineer on the islands had been captured, Pelzert ordered his men to begin salvaging the treasure. When they first set out, they had brought a total of 12 treasure chests, along with several other valuables. According to historical records, the salvage work was extremely difficult. After several days, they managed to recover only 10 chests. However, just as they were about to leave, something else went wrong. The rescue boat that arrived was only a small vessel. It could not safely carry all the survivors and the recovered treasure, so Pelzert decided to conduct a trial on the islands. After a brief trial, everyone agreed that Cornelis and several of his closest accomplices were the main architects of the mutiny and the massacre. They were sentenced to have their hands cut off and then be executed by hanging on nearby Seal Island. 2 other mutineers, whose crimes were considered less severe, were spared execution. Instead, they were marooned on the unknown Australian mainland. After several days of sailing, the rescue ship finally returned to the company headquarters. The Dutch authorities immediately began trials for the remaining members of Cornelis's group who had been brought back. In this round of trials, 5 men were sentenced to hanging for their roles in the murders. Cornelis' second-in-command, Jacob Pieters, who was accused of murdering multiple people, he was punished with a brutal breaking wheel execution, the most severe punishment available at the time. As for the captain of the Batavia, Arian Jacobs, although he did not personally participate in the massacres, he was found guilty because he helped plan the hijacking. His crimes did not warrant the death penalty, so he avoided execution, but he was imprisoned. As for Pelsaert, even though he later rescued the survivors, a board of inquiry decided that Pelsaert had exercised a lack of authority and was therefore partly responsible for what had happened. In the end, his financial assets were seized, with his reputation ruined. Pelsaert eventually chose to join another merchant ship and start over from scratch. But unfortunately, he died within a year of disease. Wiebe Hayes was hailed as a hero for his deeds on the island. To honor him, the Dutch East India Company not only gave him a substantial raise, but also promoted him to sergeant. Later, a statue was specially built to commemorate him, and it still stands today on the west coast of Australia. The publication of the Pelsaert's diary in 1647 revealed more details of the massacre that occurred on the island. The diary described the shipwreck in detail, and later became an important reference for archaeologists searching for the wreck of the Batavia. Later, the Batavia ship was successfully discovered. The wreckage, along with some of the treasures, were displayed at the Geraldton Museum in Western Australia. Archaeological teams also later found 125 bodies on the isolated island where the tragedy occurred. This disaster left a profound impact for hundreds of years. To commemorate this event, a 20th-century replica of the Batavia ship has been permanently displayed in Lelystad, the Netherlands, serving as a reminder of the tragedy and the brutal struggle for survival on the isolated island. And this is the story of the Batavia Shipwreck.